R Santana is an award-winning screenwriter and producer with over 3 decades of experience working in Hollywood and Europe. JR has been involved in productions ranging from $1 million to $25 million with an all A-list cast. As a screenwriter, he's won the Kodak Award for Outstanding Cinematic Achievement, the Turner Classic Movie Prize, Best Film at the Interfilm Berlin Film Festival, as well as being nominated for 2 consecutive BAFTA awards. Are you impressed with that, even though that was you?
It looks good on paper.
Yes, that's for sure. And Santana as well is a pretty cool second name as well, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can credit my father for that.
Yes. Now, recently on the show, of course, we had Shella Johnson talking about the book The Baloney Trail, or rather the series The Baloney Trail, and the first book is Perpetual Gloom. So I think it's quite important before we begin to give a brief reminder of that story.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the story is set in the United States and Mexico, and it's an intergenerational narrative that spans approximately 30 years from the end of the Great Depression in the 30s, late 30s. But the essential narrative pivots around a 9-year-old girl called Shelda, who, with her kind of younger siblings, are abandoned on the streets of Mexico by their parents and are forced to fend for themselves and find their way home. So that's the as I said, the pivot point for it. But there are a whole load of elements that surround that, which basically involve the early kind of beginnings of the Sinaloa, Mexican Sinaloa drugs cartel and drug smuggling and gun smuggling. So it's an amazing story that spans that time, and that's what really interested me.
Yeah. And of course, you've written a screenplay on this book. Why did you feel it deserved one?
Well, when I read the book, although I was told the main elements about, the exciting, dramatic elements that kind of hook you about the drugs cartel, drug smuggling and abandonment, all those issues. When I read the book, Perpetual Gloom, it was just fantastic. It reminded me of kind of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. The writing was incredible, and it was very, very visual. So it was a reason I really kind of engaged with it and thought this could make a great pilot, a great film, standalone film in its own right.
Yeah. And a lot of the time when you read a book that feels very visual, does it end up translating as well as you think it does?
Usually it does. There are occasions if there's so much substance to the characters within it, so it's a more of a kind of a visual telling that you struggle to kind of get a little bit of depth, but then you always approach that from the very beginning. That would be obvious right from the beginning.
Yeah.
In this case, it was a case of what do I leave out, as opposed to what am I going to put in. There's so much information there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you have to leave any important bits out, or did you manage to, find a way to keep it all similar to the book?
So I think the choice of the scenes that I did actually leave out, because they were standalone chapters and I'd already established those characters, but in themselves they're just utterly amazing. I mean, they could be films on their own, but they will appear in the episodes of the first season, no doubt.
Yeah. So what was the overall process of writing the screenplay?
Well, essentially the first thing was the first approach for me was to kind of establish how the pilot would be delivered, whether it would be a feature, whether it would be a pilot for a series, whether it be for broadcast TV or platforms like Amazon, Netflix, HBO, Apple, that sort of thing. So that also dictated some of the running times, which for some of the streaming services isn't important. because they don't go to ad breaks really.
Yeah.
For broadcasters, it is. So we opted to go for those over the top platforms, the Netflix, Amazon, all those platforms that deliver via kind of the internet.
Yeah.
And that meant that we were looking at probably a 50-minute pilot. That's how it's turned out in now. And I think reading the book, it was important to try and establish the principal characters right from the outset.
Yeah.
And really also look at those scenes that were going to be included for that first episode. We couldn't have telling audience wanting more, but at the same time give them enough information to engage them from the outset.
Yes.
There was some interesting with this particular book. There was some interesting writing choices in terms of physically writing a screenplay, the use of language and accents, whether I write that, almost phonetically to kind of generate a voice on the page and in your head, choosing the characters that we're going to be following their point of view, but also those characters will disappear, halfway through first seasons. We need to kind of retell not just the standalone chapters, which, there was one which I absolutely loved, which I would love to have included, but it will appear later on somewhere down the line.
Yeah. And how did you decide whether or not it was going to be a series or a film? Would one film just maybe not be long enough?
Yeah, I don't think one film would have been long enough. And the material is so rich that it just deserves to be broken down into seasons and episodes.
Yeah. And when you had this finished screenplay, did you have to sort of present it to Shella and make sure that you hadn't completely misrepresented her book?
Yeah, I absolutely did. And it was a case of having to also shop around scenes and slightly alter them a little bit. But thankfully, she received it really well and was very enthusiastic and excited about it. And it's great working with her because she has that very open way of it's always about the project coming first, and it's about the story coming first. And whilst these are based on true events, if we're capturing the spirit of those true events, that's what's really important, and it works for that, and it works for the narrative.
Yeah. Absolutely. And how many episodes does there end up being in the series?
They're probably going to be somewhere in the region of 12 episodes per season. It's quite a sort of an undertaking. But at the same time, like I said at the top, the material is there, and there's so many kind of little tributaries and sidebars to explore off the main channel, so there's plenty of material.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And will they be consistent in length? Because obviously you mentioned a 50-minute pilot, but of course you're on streaming services, so it's not the end of the world if one of them's a little bit longer or shorter.
That's right. And when it comes down to it, it might be 30 minutes. The ultimately the deal we strike or the commission that we receive will determine that. It might be 50 minutes, might be an hour. Then we might have a kind of a double length pilot, or in the case of some broadcasters, they also do a limited series of 90 minutes for each episode, something like that. So we'll wait and see.
Yeah, and you mentioned you're not limited by timing on streaming services, but to an extent, you kind of are in terms of people's attention spans and things. Is that something that you have to think about?
Yeah, definitely. That's already built into the screenplay, so that we're engaging people with the narrative, hopefully, and with the characters. And I think it's creating enough of those hooks at the end to want people, to engage with people and to want them to look at the next episode or binge on the next episode or multiple episodes.
Yeah. And when you wrote the pilot, did you think at that point, this is just going to be one episode pilot, or did you sort of structure the whole series first of all, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, we had a broad structure anyway. So there were certain things that I couldn't touch on in the pilot, only because of the chronology of it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any sense. So yeah, we were kind of bound by that. There was an overall plan.
I think you cut out slightly, but we got the gist of it. And
okay.
How did you know when it was ready and finished?
I went through a few drafts and I juggled different points of views and different scenes. There's a lot that was omitted from it, but really it was the flow. And when we finally got to the last draft, we were happy with, does it set up the characters? Does the story flow? Is it interesting? And would I want to see the next episode? And it's kind of planting all those seeds as well in the pilot. So it seemed to tick all the boxes for us. And yeah, we've plumped on this version at the moment.
That's quite important, actually, wanting to see the next episode, isn't it? How do you achieve that? Is it just really enjoyable, or is there cliffhangers, or?
Yeah, there are cliffhangers to some extent. I mean, the character cliffhangers. So that in the first episode, our point of view, we start with Monroe, who's a young boy, and he will take on the principal character late in the first season. So we don't see him growing up. By using it, we're able to establish the promise of more, the promise of his intention to make something of himself and to kind of shun a life that he's been living. So that's one example of how we're kind of planting the seeds and laying a foundation for the next episodes.
Yeah. And could this screenplay change even more in the future, maybe even during filming?
Absolutely, yeah. It's that's a kind of a added to it. There might be other devices that are included in it, and as we proceed through the season, I'm sure there are going to be multiple changes as we progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you plan to distribute it? I mean, are there deals in place yet, or is it just a screenplay on its own so far?
Yeah, it's just a screenplay on its own, but we have a strategy to approach the industry with it. We want really an integrated package. So we have our pilot, we have a planned episodes for the first season. We have the book, we have a website, we have audiobooks, we have the ebooks, and obviously we're kind of conducting a social campaign as well. So all of those elements will be in one effective package that we will be taking to a broadcaster or on one of the streaming services.
Yes. And because the Baloney Trail is a series, do you think you will do sort of a sequel to this series for the next books?
Yeah, the Perpetual Gloom book one certainly runs into the next two books. It is that's the beauty of it. It is that intergenerational narrative. So we will have those characters growing up, dying, evolving, and then we have a new generation coming through as time progresses across from, we go from the 30s right through to the 60s. So that journey for me is really exciting as we see those characters grow and learn, and we understand what makes them tick and their backgrounds.
Yeah, and that's sort of a time period that's not done very often, is it? The 30s all the way to the 60s. It's only 30 years, but probably don't think of the two together.
Yeah, exactly. And we're also in a very unusual world as well. So when we hit Mexico, when we hit those when we hit that all that kind of the excitement of the drugs and the gun running in terms of the narrative,
Yeah.
then it's a very unusual world. But
Yeah.
particularly because when the character Sheldon is abandoned with her two younger siblings, I mean that's exciting. For me, that's interesting. You know how this little kid is just left with her brothers and sisters on, to fend for themselves in a strange country with a
Yeah.
strange language, miles from home.
Yeah. And overall, how hard or easy did you find it to write this screenplay? I mean, presumably with all these awards you've won, you knew what you were doing.
I had a plan, but
Yeah.
the truth of it was that the hard work had been done by Shayla.
Mm.
The hard work had been done there. It was an absolute joy to write, and
Mm.
my biggest problem was what to exclude from the pilot because there was so much I wanted to put in it.
Yeah.
But they will be held over and they will appear later on in some of the later episodes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, many thanks for coming on today, and we will see you soon to talk about the
Absolutely,
audiobook, which you have also worked on. You've been very busy.
indeed, exactly. Thank you.